Hey guys, how's it going? It's Baggins here, and today I wanted to provide you guys with a tier list for perks in New World for the Brimstone Sands expansion. Pretty often during the stream, I'll be sorting through my inventory, or I'll be just finishing a dungeon run, and I'll go ahead and salvage like 99% of the drops that I get, but I will keep a few behind to either sell on the trading post or keep for a potential build that I want to use in the future. And the reason why we keep certain items is based on the perks that they have on them. So for example, here we have Trenchant Rend and Refreshing Mighty Gavel. On this Fire Staff, we have Vicious and Chain Fire. Some of these perks, for example, Chain Fire, I do rate quite a bit lower, and Vicious we rate quite highly, so we've got a sort of in-between weapon here, but some weapons and some armor pieces that you'll find will have like a perfect set of perks, and hopefully that's what today's video is going to help you guys identify. Now, in order to like go through all of these, I did think about doing the sort of classic tier list, you know, something like one of these where we drag the perks up into S, A, B, C. But because a lot of the perks in New World share the same icon, if we just go to the trading post here and take a look at perks, you can see Accelerating Flamethrower, Accelerating Charge, Accelerating Lights Embrace. They all kind of have like the same, you know, visual like look from a distance. It's just like a guy running. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to like mouse over each one of these perks, and we'll put it in alphabetical order, obviously, because that's how it's sorted here. And we'll put timestamps in the video description, so you guys will be able to scrub along and see like if there's a particular perk that you're interested in. And I'll put a link to a Google Doc as well in the description down below, where we're going to list every perk, and we're going to go through both PvE and PvP. Now, we do have a lot to get through here. We're not going to cover every single perk in the game, because I think something like Fishing Colossus, for example, it's really good when you're fishing, but like useless everywhere else. So we're going to be talking about combat-specific perks like Fire Damage, Flame Shield, Ward, Focused, and so on and so forth. Now, it is worth mentioning that this is just my opinion. I do quite a bit of PvE and PvP in New World, and we've been playing for a very long time, but ultimately, this is just the opinion of one guy on the internet. So you might find or disagree with me on certain things. Overall though, I feel like we have a generally pretty good grasp on like what is good and what is bad in the game. With that being said, if you guys find this video useful, make sure you go ahead and click the like button and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. And let's jump in and start going. So Abyssal Attunement is the first perk on the list that we're looking at. It's worth mentioning that all of the attunement perks are pretty desirable and are going to go for a high price, as they just allow you to do an additional % weapon damage with a particular element. Now, Void Damage is a little bit less useful than some of the other weapon damage types, as you're going to find that during Void Weeks for PvE, it's less useful, but in PvP, there's really not that many armors that spec against Void Damage, so we're going to be giving it an A rating in PvE and an A+ in PvP. Abyssal Conditioning, I think this one's a bit more niche. Again, not bad for Void Weeks for mutations, but really not worth it in PvP, so we're giving it a C rating for PvE and a D rating for PvP. Accelerated Resolve modifies your Defender's Resolve ability to give you increased movement speed and extra incoming healing. This can be pretty useful for a tank in PvE scenarios, so we're going to give it an A rating. However, in PvP, I just don't really rate Defender's Resolve very high as an ability, so it's going to be getting a D over there. Accelerating Flamethrower allows the burn aspect of the flamethrower to last longer and also increases your movement speed. Now, I don't find movement speed increases to be that useful in PvE, however, they are very useful in PvP. For that reason, we're going to give it a B in PvE and an A+ in PvP. Accelerating Lights Embrace, again, just gives you more movement speed, which I don't particularly find too useful in PvE, as the enemies will generally run to you. However, in PvP, in smaller scale like 3v3 arena, this could be pretty handy, so we're going to give it a D in PvE and a B in PvP. Accelerating Traps, much like the other movement speed things, just not that useful in PvE, so it's getting a D rating. However, movement speed, sometimes nice in PvP, so we're going to give it a B. Accuracy is not a perk I rate highly at all. I just think there are better things you can get on your weapons, so this is getting a D for both PvE and PvP. Alacritous Punishment is a PvP only perk, so we're automatically giving it an F for PvE, as it's just not usable, and in PvP I also think it's very, very weak, so it's going to be getting a D rating. That is just a very specific criteria, and it's really not much extra damage compared to one of the attunement perks, which just applies all the time. Alacrity increases the haste that you apply to yourself or others for a certain percentage. However, again, in PvE I just don't think this is very relevant, so we're giving it a D rating, and in PvP it's going to get a C, as there are just better perks than it. Ancient Bane and Ancient Ward are very useful in Lazarus Instrumentality and also the new dungeon, the Ennead, as there's quite a lot of ancient enemies in there. So we're going to be giving these an S rating because they allow you to do more damage and take less damage from their particular enemies, and that's for PvE. However, in PvP, this doesn't do anything, so you'll be getting an F. The same can be said with Angry Earth Bane and Angry Earth Ward. Again, are useful for Angry Earth dungeons. There's only one right now, and it is Garden of Genesis, but if you're in there, this is an S tier perk. Every other situation, though, it is not that great, and certainly in PvP, we're giving it an F. Arboreal Attunement gets high scores just for being an attunement perk. We're giving it an A+ in PvE, as many enemies are weak to nature damage. And we're also giving it an S rating in PvP, as I don't think anybody runs nature damage reduction in PvP, because it's basically just life staffs and people using this perk. Arboreal Conditioning, just like the other conditioning perks, very situational, so it's going to be getting a C rating in PvE and a D rating in PvP. Arcane Damage is very specific where it's going to be useful. I think if you're fighting against the Corrupted, it can be quite strong, so dealing extra Arcane Damage, going to get a C rating for PvE. However, in PvP, very niche, and it's going to get a D. Arcane Protection is very niche. There are very few enemies that are going to be doing Arcane Damage to you, so for that reason, it is getting a D rating in both PvE and PvP. Arcane Shield Ward and all of the Shield Ward perks are only available on tower shields. However, this one in particular is very niche, as there's really not that much arcane damage that you take in the game, so we're going to give it both a D in PvE and PvP. Both Beastbane and Beast Ward are kind of memes in New World, as there's really not many reasons that you want to spec specifically against beasts. We still don't have a beast dungeon in the game yet, other than a few enemies within Barnacles and Black Powder, so it's getting a D+, because it's just slightly useful in some situations in PvE. However, it's an F in PvP, as yeah, it's not relevant. Beloved is a PvE only perk, as you're not going to get less threat from other players. As much as that would be nice, it's not possible. However, it is pretty niche, and I really don't think you need many of these on your armor, if any at all. So we're giving it a C for PvE and an F for PvP. Bleeding Sweep is a solid perk for the spear, as it allows the leg sweep ability to apply a bleed. Now, I don't think this is an absolute must-have perk, but it is very strong, so we're going to give it an A rating in both PvE and PvP. Blessed is an absolute mandatory perk for the life staff, and therefore it is getting both an S rating in PvE and PvP. You always want to have Blessed on your life staff. It's just a no-brainer. Blight Resistance does nothing in PvP, and it's also very, very niche in PvE as well, so it's going to be getting a D rating in PvE and an F rating in PvP. Bloodletting allows bleeds that you apply to last longer. This can be useful for some spear and rapier builds, but I do think it's quite niche in PvE, so we're going to give it a C rating. For PvP, I think it's a little bit stronger, and we're going to give it a B rating. Brilliant increases your max mana pool. However, I just don't think that mana pool management in general is really worth it, because you can always just drink a mana potion and like basically restore your mana to full. So we're going to give this both a D in PvE and a D in PvP. Burning allows burns that you apply to last a little bit longer. However, this is a bit more of a niche perk for the ring. I'm going to go ahead and give it a C rating in PvE and a B in PvP, as it can be a little bit advantageous to have those burns last longer when you're like dotting up lots of players at the same time. Now we're going to cover all of the chain perks at the same time, as I think they're roughly all around the same power level. Chain Fire in PvE is going to be useful against the Angry Earth. Chain Ice is going to be useful against the Lost, and Arcane against the Corrupted, so they're a little bit more powerful in PvE, but in general, I just think there are better perks you can have on your weapon than these, so we're giving them a C rating for Chain Arcane, Chain Fire, Chain Ice, Chain Lightning, Chain Nature, and Chain Void, and then in PvP, they're going to be getting a D rating. There's just better perks than this, frankly. Contagious Reverse Stab modifies the Reverse Stab ability to transfer one debuff from you to the target that you hit. It also allows the ability to do a little bit of extra damage. Reverse Stab is an ability that's used quite often in both PvE and PvP. However, I don't think the perk is particularly that strong, so we're going to give it a B rating for PvE and a B rating for PvP. Corrupted Bane and Corrupted Ward are very useful perks in PvP, as a lot of expeditions do feature the corrupted enemy types, so being able to do extra damage and take less damage from them is going to make it an S tier perk in PvE for the relevant dungeons. However, since enemy players that you fight against are not corrupted, it is an F tier for PvP. Corruption Resistance is a D tier perk for PvE, as it really just doesn't do much at all. It's not necessary, and of course in PvP it's not relevant at all, so it's going to get an F for PvP. Crippling, slowing enemies is not really something that you particularly care about doing in PvE. However, in PvP it can be somewhat useful, so we're going to give it a D for PvE and a C for PvP. Crippling Blast Shot, and the same with most of these crippling perks, it's not really that useful in PvE, as you don't really want to be slowing down the enemies, you just want to get up to them and kill them. We're going to be giving it a D tier in PvE. However, you know, slowing down players can be very useful in PvP, so we're giving it an A. Crippling Feral Rush, for the same reason that we stated with Blast Shot, we're going to be giving it a D tier in PvE and an A tier in PvP. Crippling Powder Burn, also like the other crippling abilities, is going to be getting a D tier in PvE and an A tier in PvP. Crippling Reap, again, we're giving it a D tier in PvE and an A tier in PvP. Critical Retribution is a PvP only perk, so therefore it is getting an F rating for PvE. However, in PvP can be somewhat useful, but I still think it's a little bit more on the niche end, so we're going to give it a B rating. Deadly Flourish modifies the Flourish and Finish ability to do extra damage if the target's below 50%, so it's effectively like an Execute. Executes, I think, are very strong in PvP, but not necessarily needed in PvE currently, so we are going to be giving it a C rating for PvE and an A rating for PvP. Deadly Frost modifies the Ice Shower ability to do extra damage per second to people who walk into it, and it also reduces the cooldown by a fair percentage as well. I think this is an ability that's much more useful in PvP than PvE, so we are going to be giving it a C rating for PvE and a B rating for PvP. Despised is a perk you can use as a tank to increase your threat in PvE. It does not work in PvP, and I also don't think it's terribly needed in PvE either, so we're going to be giving it a C rating for PvE and a F rating for PvP. Diminishing Orb modifies the Orb of Decay ability to reduce buffs on a target by up to 50% when it hits them. Reducing buffs on the target is something that's not terribly useful in PvE, but it can have some pretty strong applications in PvP, and for that reason it is getting a D rating in PvE and a B rating in PvP. Diminishing Shield Bash, much like the Orb, reduces the duration of buffs on the target when you hit them with Shield Bash. Again, not very useful in PvE, and it will get a D rating, but can have some application in PvP and gets a B. Divine is a pretty solid perk to have on your amulet, increases the amount of incoming healing you receive. However, I do think there are better amulet perks you can get, so we are going to be giving it a B rating in both PvE and PvP. Duplicating Toast makes it so that when you drink a potion, there's a percentage chance that it doesn't consume, but this is a pretty useless perk in both PvE and PvP, and there's certainly better ones you can have. It's going to be getting a D for both categories. Efficient Burnout modifies your Burnout ability to increase your mana regen after you use the ability and also make your next hit do extra fire damage. Burnout is an ability that's used in PvP a lot but rarely sees any use in PvE, and for that reason we're going to be giving it a D rating in PvE and a B rating in PvP. Elemental Aversion is a pretty solid perk. It reduces the damage you take from ranged elemental attacks and potentially also reduces the damage you take from elemental abilities. Because of that reason, we are going to be giving it a B in PvE and an A rating in PvP. Empowered makes it so that empower you apply to yourself and others lasts longer. This can be somewhat useful in PvE, as you are going to be empowering yourself fairly frequently. However, in PvP, I think this is a bit more niche, and for that reason, it's going to be getting a B rating in PvE and a D rating for PvP. Empowered Armor Breaker is an incredibly niche perk for the Armor Breaker ability. When you break a block, the next hit within 5 seconds does a bit of extra damage. I just think this is really like mediocre, and we're going to be giving it a D rating in both PvE and PvP. Empowering Breaker makes it so that when your attacks are blocked, you gain extra empower. However, your attacks really don't get blocked that often, so we're going to give this a D plus in PvE, as there are some blocking enemies, but it's going to get a D in PvP, as most people just dodge instead of block. Empowering Explosive Arrow makes it that the next hit you do after you use Explosive Arrow does extra damage, but Explosive Arrow I think is pretty average as an ability, so we're giving it a C rating in both PvE and PvP. Empowering Fireball is a solid perk to have. You're going to use Fireball in pretty much all PvE and PvP scenarios, and it just makes it do extra damage. So for that reason, we're giving it an S rating in both PvE and PvP. Empowered Leaping Strike modifies the Leaping Strike ability so that you do extra damage to the target after you hit them with the ability. Now, Leaping Strike does see quite a bit of use in PvP as a gap closer if using Sword and Shield, but really not that much use in PvE, so we're going to give it a C rating for PvE and an A plus for PvP. Empowering Meteor Shower is a perk that I guess you should use if you're going to use Meteor Shower. It does give you quite a bit of extra damage, but Meteor Shower itself is kind of like a bit of a meh ability. So we're going to give it a C rating for both PvE and PvP, because it is worth using if you're going to use Meteor Shower, but still just generally like, you know, not a good ability. Good perk, not a good ability. Empowered Rending Throw makes it so that after you land a Rending Throw, your ranged attacks do extra damage. Now sadly, ranged Hatchet still hasn't really caught on, and as a result, this perk is kind of meh as well, so we're going to give it a D rating for both PvE and PvP. Empowering Shooter Stance makes it so that after you hit somebody with Shooter Stance, you get a massive spike in damage for 3 seconds. In general, I think Musket's kind of meh in PvE, so we're going to give it a B rating for PvE, but in PvP this can be devastating, and it's getting an S rating for PvP. Empowering Whirling Blade makes it so that Whirling Blade does extra damage if there's more enemies within the radius of you, but in general this ability doesn't see a lot of use, and I also think the perk is pretty hard to meet the criteria, so it's getting a D rating in both PvE and PvP. Enchanted makes it so that your light and heavy attacks do extra damage to a target. Now this is a pretty useful perk, however it doesn't apply to any abilities, so you need a non-ability focused weapon, something like the bow. As a result, we're going to be giving it an A rating in PvE and an A+ in PvP. Energizing Counter is the first Greatsword perk we're coming across, and I think this is a really strong perk. It basically just gives you insta stamina when you press the ability, which can be useful in both PvE and PvP. I think stamina is a little bit more important for PvP, so we're giving it an A rating in PvE and an S rating in PvP. Energizing Evade Shot makes it so that after you land the shot, you get some cooldown reduction on the ability and you get extra stamina. Again, I think stamina is a little bit more important in PvP as opposed to PvE, so we're giving it a C rating in PvE and a B rating in PvP. It's okay, but it's just not super great. Enfeebling is a perk that when you apply Weaken, it lasts longer. However, this is pretty niche. It can be handy on some bosses and I guess some players, but generally there are better perks in this slot. It gets a C rating in both PvE and PvP. Enfeebling Maelstrom is an absolute powerhouse of a perk. It makes it so that when you land Maelstrom hits on anybody in the radius, you'll put a Weaken on them for 8 seconds. I do think this is slightly more powerful in PvP than PvE. However, we're giving it an A rating for PvE and an S rating for PvP. This is a must-have, really, for most Great Axe builds. Enfeebling Poison Shot applies a Weaken to Poison Shot, which reduces the target's damage, but you have to hit them specifically with the Poison Shot, which makes it quite a bit worse. We're going to give it a C rating in PvE and a C rating in PvP. Enfeebling Skewer applies a pretty solid Weaken to the target that you hit with Skewer for 8 seconds. It's a little bit weaker than Enfeebling Maelstrom, but still pretty damn strong. We're going to give it A rating in PvE and an S rating in PvP. Evasive is an earring perk that reduces your threat generation for 5 seconds after you dodge. This can be pretty useful for healers, but obviously is a PvE only perk. So we're giving it a B rating in PvE and an F rating in PvP. Exhausted Exploitation is a PvP only perk that allows you to slow exhausted players. It's a bit niche, and as a result of being PvP only, it's getting an F rating in PvE and a C rating in PvP. Exhausted Infected Throw reduces target's stamina regeneration when you hit them with it. This is not really needed in PvE and is getting a D rating. It can be somewhat useful in PvP though if you were using the ability, so it's going to get a B rating for PvP. Exhaustive Net Shot makes it so that you reduce the stamina generation of the target that you hit by up to 33% for 8 seconds. This is very powerful in PvP, but not really needed in PvE. As a result, we're giving it a D rating in PvE and an S rating in PvP. Fire Damage is an incredibly useful perk to have on your ring. You just do extra fire damage. If you're using the Fire Staff or any weapons that have fire-related abilities, it's just going to allow you to hit harder. As a result, we're going to give it an S rating in PvE and an S rating in PvP. Flame Attunement allows you to do extra weapon damage as fire. Like all of the other attunement perks, this is highly desirable. It's going to get an A rating in PvE and an A+ in PvP, as not that many players go against for fire damage absorption. Flame Conditioning, like all of the other conditioning perks, is very niche, quite specific only for fire mutations, so we're going to give it a C rating in PvE and a D rating in PvP. Flame Protection is definitely a perk you want to have on your amulet during fire weeks in mutated expeditions. As a result, we're giving it an S tier in PvE, and it's going to get an A tier in PvP, as there are quite a lot of Fire Staff users out there as well. Flame Shield Ward, like with all of the Shield Ward perks, only applies to Tower Shield, but if you are rocking a Tower Shield, it's not a bad idea to pick it up for Mutated Expeditions. We're going to give it a B rating in PvE and an A rating in PvP. If you're going against, lots of Fire Staff users, it's pretty good. Focused increases your mana regeneration, but I just think you can drink a mana potion, so we're going to give this one a D rating in both PvE and PvP. Fortified can be useful for players using Lifestaff and Arboreal Protection. It can increase the Fortify by a pretty decent amount. I think this is a little bit more useful in PvE than PvP, so we're going to give it an A rating in PvE and a B rating for PvP. Fortified Recovery, this is a really crappy perk in my opinion. You get a 10% Fortify for 5 seconds with like a 3-year cooldown. As a result, we're giving it a D rating in both PvE and PvP. Fortifying Perforate is a pretty nuts ability. Sadly, it was nerfed with the Brimstone Sands patch because it used to persist even when you swapped away from the spear, but now it's only active while you have the spear. That being said, it's still, if you're going to use this ability, it's really one to have, so it's getting an A rating, maybe even an A+ in both PvE and PvP. Fortifying Sacred Ground, this is just an absolute must-have. Pretty much every healer is going to use Sacred Ground, and to add an extra Fortify to the ability just makes it even stronger. This is an Ultra S tier for both PvE and PvP. Fortifying Shield Rush is an excellent perk to have if you're going to be using the Shield Rush ability, as it increases your damage absorption, which is great for tank players. I think if you are using a Shield Rush, then this is just a no-brainer. I'm going to give it an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Fortifying Whirlwind, I think, is a bit of a mediocre perk and also kind of a mediocre ability. As a result, we're going to give it a D rating in both PvE and PvP. Fractured Rend is an incredibly niche perk. It says when you block break a player, you put Rend on them, but it's not even a very big Rend, and it's not really for a long duration either. So yeah, PvP only, it's getting an F rating in PvE and a D rating in PvP. Freedom is a much more PvP-centric perk, and it can save you in a lot of situations in PvP, but isn't really needed in PvE, so we're going to give it a C rating for PvE and an S rating for PvP. Frost Attunement, just like with the other attunement perks, allows you to do extra damage as Frost. This can be very useful in many different situations. I think it's extra useful in PvP to synergize with the ultimate chill on the Ice Gauntlet, so we're going to be giving it an A+ in PvE and an S tier rating in PvP. Frost Conditioning, like the other conditioning things, just a bit niche. We're going to give it a C rating in PvE and a D rating in PvP. Frozen Protection makes you take less ice damage, which can be very useful in ice mutations and also very useful against all of the ice gauntlets that are out there in PvP. As a result, we're giving it an S rating for PvE and an A+ for PvP. Frozen Shield Ward reduces the amount of damage you take from ice damage if you have this on your tower shield. Can be very useful for tanks in both PvE and certainly in PvP, as you're going to be standing in a lot of ice storms when they drop them on you. As a result, we're giving it a B rating in PvE and an S rating in PvP. Hated allows your weapon to generate more threat, which can be useful for tanks in PvE, but in general, there are much better perks to have on your weapon. We're going to give this a C tier in PvE, and since there is no threat in PvP other than being a healer, this is going to get an F tier for PvP. Healing Tomb does heal off of your base health, which makes this perk actually quite a bit worse than it sounds. We're going to give this a D tier in PvE, as there's just better Ice Gauntlet abilities to use, and a C tier in PvP for at least a little bit of healing, and just Ice Tomb does get used more in PvP. Health is one of the best perks to have on your amulet, just increases your health pool. This is relevant for both PvE and PvP, so it gets an S tier in both of them. Healthy Toast is a perk that I rate super highly as a healer, but I think a lot of other classes or roles can benefit from it as well. We're going to give it an A tier in PvE, but an S tier in PvP, as that every little bit of healing sometimes counts in those PvP fights. Hearty increases your stamina pool. This allows you to do 3 dodge rolls when you're in light armor, even if you don't have 150 dexterity, and as a result, that's incredibly strong for both PvP and PvE, so we're getting an easy S tier for both of those categories. Ice damage just allows you to do more ice damage. If you have an ice gauntlet, this is a no-brainer to have, and we're going to give it both an S tier in PvE and an S tier in PvP. Iced Refresh makes it so that when you land a killing blow with Ice Spike, it lowers all your cooldowns by up to 42%, or it lowers all your Ice Gauntlet cooldowns. Now, there are better Ice Gauntlet abilities. There is some potential you could make this work in PvE, but I don't think it's working in PvP, so we're going to give it a C tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Indestructible is probably one of the worst perks you can have on your armor. It's an F in both PvE and an F in PvP. Infected makes disease last longer. Now, disease is pretty relevant in PvP as it reduces incoming healing, but I still just think there are better perks to have in this slot. We're gonna give it a D in PvE and a D plus just for being somewhat a bit more relevant in PvP. Insatiable Gravity Well makes it so that you cast another Gravity Well when you throw one out from the Grid X. Gravity Well is an insanely good ability in both PvE and PvP for bunching things up, so we're gonna give this an S tier in PvE and an S tier in PvP. Invigorated reduces the duration of Weaken, Rend, Exhaust, Disease on you. This can be useful in quite a few PvE fights, in particular the final boss fight of Barnacles and Black Powder. This is a really good perk to have, so we're gonna give it an A plus in PvE and a B tier in PvP for being okay but not like a must-have. Invigorated Punishment is a PvP only perk, so we're giving it an F in PvE. However, extra damage in PvP can always be nice, so we're gonna give it A tier for PvP. Keen increases your crit chance, which most builds can benefit from other than people using a life staff. However, it's like there are better perks than this. Vicious, for example, I think is just going to be better for most builds. Also in PvP, a lot of people run Resilient, which gives them reduced damage when they take crits. So although this may be a bit controversial, we're going to give it an A tier in PvE and an A tier in PvP. Keen Awareness, much like Keen, increases your crit chance. This is just on the ring instead. For the reasons that we stated with Keen, we're going to give this an A tier in PvE and an A tier in PvP. Vicious Beacon increases the crit chance of any player it heals. If you have this on the life staff itself, it can increase the crit chance of players by 10%, which is really not that bad for a group fight scenario. However, I do think there are better perks. Nonetheless, we're going to give it an A tier in PvE and an A tier in PvP. Keen Berserk increases your crit chance while under 50%. I do think this is probably more of a PvE thing than a PvP. Again, crit chance in PvP is always negated by Resilient, but we're going to give it an A tier for PvE and a B tier for PvP. Keen Speed increases your movement speed by 20% whenever you crit. It's got a 10-second cooldown, but it lasts for 10 seconds, so you can effectively keep this going forever, provided you get those crits. Movement speed is really, really good in PvP and can help you not die or chase down an enemy, but in PvE, not really needed. For that reason, we're going to give it a C tier in PvE and an A plus in PvP. Keen Tondo increases your crit chance against somebody who's hit by the bleed. If you are using Tondo, this is a pretty excellent ability for both PvE and PvP. We're going to give it an A tier for both categories. Keen Vault Kick increases your crit chance after you land the ability for 5 seconds. I think this is an ability that's used much more often in PvP than PvE. As a result, we're going to give it a C tier in PvE and a B tier for PvP. Keenly Empowered is just a big old damage boost. 15% extra damage for 5 seconds with a 10-second cooldown. This has got a lot of uptime, and it's very strong. I'm going to give this an S tier for both PvE and PvP. This is a great perk to have on most DPS weapons. Keenly Fortified gives you a 10% fortify for 3 seconds. I think compared to some of the other Keenly procs, this is one of the weaker ones. We're going to give it a C tier in both PvE and PvP. Keenly Jagged makes it so that when you crit somebody, you will apply a bleed for 6 seconds. I do think this has a little bit more use in PvP as it allows you to track them more effectively in a crowd. You can see the damage numbers popping up above their head. In some ways, it's kind of like wall hacks is what people have described it to me. For that reason, we are going to go ahead and give this a B tier for PvE and an A tier for PvP. Kind is a weapon perk that reduces the amount of threat you generate. It can be maybe useful for some players, but in general, I think there are much better perks. And of course, this doesn't apply to PvP. We're going to give it a C tier in PvE and an F tier for PvP. Lasting Rain of Arrows increases the bleed and slow from the ability itself, but the ability is pretty mediocre, and so is the effect. So it's going to get a C tier for both PvE and PvP. Leeching is a ring perk that gives you lifesteal, basically. This can be very useful for some speedrunning groups that use all hatchets in PvE expeditions. We're going to give it an S tier for PvE and an A tier for PvP, just being a little bit weaker on that front. Leeching Crosscut allows you to heal for the final strike of Crosscut, and it can be up to 72% on your weapon, which is really crazy, actually. That's going to be a huge heal. So we're going to give it an S tier in PvE, because I think you can more reliably land it, and an A plus in PvP. Leeching Cyclone is a bit of a meme. This ability doesn't see much use, but I guess the perk is okay. We're going to give it a C tier in PvE and a D tier in PvP, because, again, just Cyclone isn't going to work in PvP, and maybe for some solo PvE builds it might be okay. Leeching Flurry is a very polarizing perk. I think in PvE, this is incredibly strong. You can spam this on a big pack of enemies and like just spam your cooldowns like crazy, and it give you a lot of lifesteal. So we're gonna give it an S tier in PvE, but I think the idea of like flurrying against other players in PvP is ridiculous, so we're giving it a D tier for PvP. Leeching Path of Destiny is kind of the opposite of Leeching Flurry. I think it's more viable in PvP than in PvE, so we're going to give it a C tier for PvE and an A tier for PvP. Leeching Shrapnel Blast, much like Leeching Path of Destiny, is more of a PvP orientated ability. You're going to see much more blunderbusses used in PvP than PvE. As a result, we're giving it a C tier for PvE and a B tier for PvP. Lifestealing is a perk you can put on your weapon to give you lifestealing, funny enough. We're going to give it a B tier in PvE, but only a C tier in PvP, as I think it's a bit more tricky to get value out of this in PvP scenarios, unless you're doing like a melee 1v1. Lightning Damage is a very niche perk. The only time you're really going to be doing lightning damage is if you put a topaz gem in your weapon. Good against the ancients, but everywhere else kind of sucks. So we're giving it a C tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Lightning Protection is also very niche. There's really not that many enemies or anybody doing lightning damage in the game outside of the Siren Arena and a few enemies in Barnacles and Black Powder. So we're going to give it a D tier in PvE and a D tier for PvP. Lightning Shield Ward, much like Lightning Protection, is just like very niche. So we're giving it a D tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Both Lost Bane and Lost Ward are very useful if you're running Barnacles and Black Powder. These are going to be S tier for PvE in that scenario, but obviously F tier in PvP, as no players, well, some of them are lost, but not in the same way that this perk means. Luck is a perk that I despise having on my gear, but I will consider it for chest runs. If you are specifically doing chest runs, this is an S tier perk, but for everywhere else, I'm giving it a C tier in PvE and an F tier for PvP, because there's no luck in PvP. It doesn't apply to anything. Mana Recovery allows you to regenerate some mana when you're hit while below 50%, but you could just drink a mana potion and get the same amount of mana, and you don't have to wait 30-second cooldown. So we're gonna give it a D tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Mana Toast, much like all the other mana regeneration, mana recovery perks, just not really needed because mana potions are so accessible. So we're gonna give this a D tier in PvE and a D tier for PvP. Mending Execute allows you to heal for a percentage of the damage done with Execute, but we compare this to the Crosscut ability. It's just a smaller heal, and also the Execute ability is worse, so we're gonna give it a C tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Mending Protection is a really powerful ability. If you're gonna be using Arboreal Protection, you should definitely take this perk as well. It is an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Mending Sticky Bomb seems to be a bit counter to what the musket playstyle is, where you just want to kill things as fast as possible, but this is giving you some sustain, which I don't really think you need until they make like musket more viable for longer drawn out fights. So we're gonna give it a D tier in both PvE and PvP. Mortal Empowerment is a PvP only perk, so we're giving it an F tier for PvE. However, in PvP, this can be really crazy. If you can pop off, you can stack up a big damage boost up to 30% increase in damage. So we're giving it an S tier for PvP if you're a Poggers player. Mortal Energy is not a bad perk to run for PvE when you're clearing out big packs of enemies, but I think it's more difficult to get value out of this perk in PvP. We're gonna give it a B tier for PvE and a C tier for PvP. Mortal Fortification, I think, is one of the weaker mortal perks, and again, all of these are a little bit worse in PvP, as you're not going to be like popping off with that many kills, and if you are, then you don't need the perks anyway. We're going to give this a C tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Mortal Lifesteal, very useful for killing waves of enemies in PvE. It's getting a B tier for PvE and a C tier for PvP. Mortal Power gives you a 15% damage boost for 20 seconds whenever you kill something. I think this is probably one of the more powerful mortal perks out there, and as a result, we're going to give it an A tier for PvE and a B tier for PvP. Mortal Refreshment lowers your cooldowns when you kill something by 10%. Again, more of a PvE-centric perk. We're giving this an A tier for PvE, but a D tier for PvP. I just don't think you're gonna be like killing that many waves of players. Mortal Siphoning, just like all the other perks that give you mana, goes to the D category in both PvE and PvP because you can just drink a mana potion. Nature Damage is a very niche perk. It's pretty much only the life staff that's gonna deal nature damage unless you have an amber gem in your weapon. As a result, we're gonna give it a C tier for both PvE and PvP. Nature Protection is really good when it's a nature week. You want to have this on your amulet for mutated expeditions, but in PvP, it's really not going to save you against much damage damage at all. We're going to give it an S tier specifically for the mutated dungeons, but it's going to get a D tier in PvP. Nature Shield Ward, again, if you're a tank running a Nature Mutated Expedition, it's a B tier for PvE. However, you don't really need it for PvP. It's getting a D tier in PvP. Nibble increases your stamina regeneration, but it's by a very small amount, and I actually don't rate this perk that highly. We're going to give it a C tier in PvE and a C plus just because it's a little bit more relevant in PvP. Nullifying Oblivion removes buffs off of players when it lands. Used to be very powerful against Sacred Ground and also remove food buffs once upon a time, but has been brought into line a bit since then. We're going to give it a C tier in PvE and an A tier for PvP. Omnidirectional Evade can basically be a permanent damage boost in PvE, as you can really lower the cooldown of this just by spamming it into an enemy. As a result, we're going to give it an S tier in PvE, but only an A tier in PvP, as it's just not quite as spammable. Penetrating Backstab would be a really good perk for PvP if more players were heavily armored, but everybody's in light armor these days. It is PvP only, so we're going to give it an F tier for PvE and a C tier for PvP. Penetrating Headshot is another PvP only perk, so as a result, it's getting an F tier in PvE. We're giving it a D tier in PvP because I think it's just a bit inconsistent. No heavily armored players really, and just landing headshots maybe a bit more tricky to do for most players. Penetrating Rapid Shot increases armor penetration of all of the attacks of Rapid Shot. It's okay, but it's not exceptional. We're going to give it a C tier in both PvE and PvP. Penetrating Wrecking Ball, much like Rapid Shot, just gives you armor penetration from the ability. It's not bad. It would be better if there was more heavily armored targets. We're going to give it a C tier in PvE and a C tier for PvP. Physical Aversion is a pretty good perk to have for healers and quite a few other players as well. It reduces the damage you take from ranged physical attacks, which obviously includes bows and muskets. We're going to give it a B tier for PvE, but an A plus in PvP, as there's still a lot of bow users running around in most PvP scenarios. Plague Crits reduces a target's incoming healing by a percentage if you crit them while they're under 50%. Reducing a target's incoming healing, very powerful for PvP, but not really needed in PvE. As a result, we're giving it a D tier for PvE and a B tier for PvP. Plague Splitting Grenades reduces the target's incoming healing when they're hit by the Splitting Grenade. Again, not really useful for PvE, but very strong in PvP. We're going to give this a D tier for PvE and an A tier for PvP. Plague Strikes reduces a target's incoming healing for 8 seconds by a certain percentage when you hit them with a heavy attack. This is pretty easy to apply, but again, only really relevant for PvP. We're going to give it a D tier for PvE, but an A tier for PvP. Poisoning makes poison last longer, but I think this is very, very niche, so we're going to give it both a D tier in PvE and PvP. Purify removes all debuffs on you when you drop below 50%, but it does have a steep 90-second cooldown on it. I think this can be potentially useful in some fringe PvP scenarios, but not really needed in PvE, so we're giving it a D tier for PvE and a C tier for PvP. Purifying Crits is a PvP only perk, so we're giving it an F tier for PvE, and we're going to go ahead and give it a C tier for PvP, as I think it's the cooldown's just a little bit too long on it. Purifying Toast is not a bad perk, but it's not a great perk either. We're going to give it a C tier for both PvE and PvP. Purity of Light modifies the Splash of Light ability to do a little bit of extra healing if it removes a debuff. I think this ability is going to see a bit more use in PvE than PvP, especially with the new dungeon, so we're going to give it an A tier for PvE and a B tier for PvP. Putrefying Scream is one of the most powerful incoming healing debuffs you can apply in the game. If you're using Scream, you definitely want to have this perk. It can even work in some nature mutations where the enemy receives extra healing, or with Indomitable where they have life stealing, so we're going to give this a B tier in PvE and an S tier for PvP. Pylon Burst is a bit of a weird perk. I'm not really too keen on this, but I know that speedrunners who use Ice Gauntlet really rate the Ice Pylon really highly, so we're gonna go ahead and give this an S tier for PvE, but a C tier in PvP, as yeah, I just don't think you really want to be using Ice Pylon that much in PvP. Refreshing is a perk that can benefit absolutely everybody, just reducing your cooldowns. Again, just useful for everybody. S tier in both PvE and PvP. Refreshing Charge lowers the cooldown of charge when you land the sort of follow-up attack, but the perk's kinda crappy, and you don't really see charge getting used that much these days, maybe a bit more in PvP, so we're gonna give it a D tier in PvE and a D plus in PvP. Refreshing Distancing Throw reduces the cooldown if you land it within 6 meters. I think I've seen a few people using this in PvP to good effect, but not really going to see any use in PvE. We're going to give it a D tier for the PvE category and a B tier for PvP. Refreshing Divine Embrace is one of my favorite perks to currently have. You can get this on the Glowing Life Crystal Staff, and I think it's very strong. Reduces the cooldown by a noticeable amount, so we're going to give it an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Refreshing Evasion was nerfed a little while ago. It used to be like very contending with Refreshing and sometimes quite a bit better, but I still think it's decent, just a little bit weaker than Refreshing, so we're going to give it an A tier for both PvE and PvP. In particular, if you have an ability with a really long cooldown, Refreshing Evasion sometimes can be a bit better than Refreshing though. Refreshing Flesh lowers the cooldown of the ability when you land a critical backstab. Now, I think any backstab is considered a critical, so not sure on that description there, but we're going to give it a D tier in PvE as you're not really using Flesh there, but Flesh does get used a lot in PvP, so it's an A tier for PvP. Refreshing Mighty Gavel, it's kind of like the opposite of Flesh, where it sees a lot more use in PvE than PvP, so we're going to go ahead and give it an A tier for PvE, but only a C tier for PvP. Refreshing Move is an insanely good perk, reduces your cooldowns every time you land a light or heavy attack. This is useful for a ton of different weapons. It's going to get an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Refreshing Penetrating Shot might be one of the worst perks in the game. I just don't understand why it's so bad. You have to get the kill, and then it only reduces the cooldown of that particular ability as well. You know, you compare it to Refreshing Ice Spike, that lowers all of the abilities on the Ice Gauntlet, whereas this is only for itself and if you get the killing blow. So yeah, we're gonna give it a D tier for both PvE and PvP. Refreshing Pillar of Fire is an okay ability, but you don't see that much Pillar of Fire usage. We're gonna give it a C tier in PvE and a C tier in PvP. Refreshing Power Shot can lower the cooldown of the ability by a dramatic amount if you have it on the musket itself, and as a result, it can be useful for just like spamming some levels on the musket or just killing a bunch of enemies for some reason that you need to farm them. We're gonna give it a C tier in PvE, but a D tier in PvP. Refreshing Rupture makes it so that Essence Rupture recharges faster when you land the ability on a target. You don't really use Rupture in PvP at all, but in PvE, I think it's pretty excellent. So we're gonna give it an A tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Refreshing Toast allows you to use your potions more often. This is handy in almost every single scenario, so it's an S tier for PvE and S tier for PvP. Refreshing Torrent, to my understanding, is one of the best in slot perks you can have on a hatchet for PvE, so it's an S tier there. In PvP, I don't think you're going to see too much use on it though, so it's a C tier for PvP. Refreshing Ward can be very handy for tanks and anybody expecting to take a lot of damage, get hit multiple times, so tanks in PvE, we're going to give it an A tier for PvE, B tier in PvP, as I don't think you want to really be getting hit that much most of the time. Regenerating just gives you health per second. It's somewhat useful, but it is a small heal. We're going to give it a B tier in PvE and a C tier for PvP. Relentless Freedom makes it so the ability removes roots and slows and also increases its critical chance. This is very useful in PvP. However, in PvE, it's only going to get a C tier and it's getting an A tier for PvP. Repulsing Clear Out is a bit of a meme ability. There's not really that many situations where you want to knock the enemies super far away from you. It's just going to piss off your group in an Expedition and in PvP. You know, it could be fun, but generally, if you're using a Warhammer, you want the enemy to be closer to you, so we're giving it a D tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Repulsing Stopping Power, just like Repulsing Clear Out, there's not really that many reasons why you want to knock somebody back super far. I guess it makes more sense with the musket, but we're still giving this a D tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Resilient is a PvP only perk, but it is an absolute must-have for PvP, so we're going to give it an F tier for PvE, but an S tier, or even like a S plus for PvP. Rogue is a very solid perk to have on your weapons. You do more backstab damage. It's very easy to get backstabs in PvE, as you can just have the tank turn the enemy away from you and then hit them in the back. So for that reason, we're giving it an S tier in PvE, but only an A tier in PvP. Ruinous allows you to do more damage to like horns and cannons and stuff in wars, but outside of that, not really useful at all. I'm giving this a F tier in PvE, as again, it's for PvP, and it's getting a D tier in the PvP category. Sacred is a must-have perk for healers to have on their ring. Obviously, anybody who's not healing, it's going to be a terrible perk, but specifically for healers on the ring, Sacred is an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Shirking Abyss makes it so that when you dodge through an attack, you do extra damage on your next hit within 6 seconds. It's just like kind of a bit of a mediocre perk though, in my opinion. We're going to give it a C tier in both PvE and PvP. Shirking Arcane, however, has a little bit more use in PvE because the Corrupted take extra damage from Arcane, so we're going to give it a C plus in PvE and a C tier in PvP. Shirking Debilitate Cleanse makes it so when you dodge through an enemy attack, you lose 1 rend weaken, exhaust, or disease, but it can only trigger once every 5 seconds. These are very important debuffs to drop, but you do have to be in a medium equip load. That being said, it is a very powerful perk, so we're going to give it an A tier in PvE and an S tier for PvP. Shirking Dark Cleanse is kind of like Shirking Debilitate Cleanse, except you have to be in a light equip load, and it removes Bleed, Burn, and Poison instead of Rend, Weaken, Exhaust, Disease. These debuffs are a little bit less important. We're going to give this an A tier in PvE and an A tier for PvP. Shirking Power is a PvP only perk, so we're giving it an F for PvE, but in PvP it's pretty strong. It's going to get an A tier for PvP. Shirking Energy is an absolutely bonkers perk. If you're in a light load, when you dodge something, you gain stamina. This is crazy good for PvP, and it's also really, really good for PvE as well. S tier across the board for this one. Shirking Flames, much like the other sort of Shirking Elemental thing, it's just like, it's okay, it's extra damage, but it's not great. It's a C tier in both PvE and PvP. Shirking Fortification, much like Shirking Energy, is a really powerful perk. It gives you damage absorption every time you dodge through an attack. This is super useful in both PvE and PvP, so we're going to give it an S tier for both of them. Shirking Frost, much like the other Shirking elements, is just kind of okay. C tier for PvE, C tier for PvP. Shirking Heals is a PvP only perk, so it's automatically getting F tier for PvE. In PvP, I think it's pretty good, just not insane, so we're going to give it a B tier for PvP. Shirking Lightning, Shirking Nature, just like the Shirking Frost, Shirking Flames, we're giving it a C tier for both of the categories. Siege Ward is a perk that I honestly didn't even know was in the game. You receive 6% less damage from siege weapons. This is so incredibly niche, and it's such a like really small damage reduction. We're gonna give it an F tier for PvE, obviously, and in PvP, I think this is gonna be my first and only D-. I kind of want to give it a F as well, but I guess it's like maybe useful, like if you're running at cannons sometimes. Yeah. Siphoning, just like all the other mana regeneration perks, and Siphoning Blow, just not handy. You just drink mana potions, and that's an easier way to get mana back. We're going to give it a D for both Siphoning and Siphoning Blow in PvE and PvP. Skyward Nullification, I think, is actually one of the weaker perks for the Greatsword, which is saying something because most of them are pretty damn strong. We're going to give this a D tier in PvE, a C tier in PvP because removing buffs is a little bit more useful there. Slash Damage is going to be an easy S tier for both PvE and PvP. If you're using a Hatchet, a Great Axe, or of course the Greatsword, it's just going to do more damage. So yeah, S tier PvE, S tier PvP. Slash Protection is very useful. Obviously in PvP, it's going to help you against the millions of Greatswords that are going to be out there, and there's quite a few enemies in PvE that do slash damage as well. So we're giving it an A tier for PvE and an S tier for PvP. Slash Shield Ward, much like Slash Protection, is fairly useful in PvE against a lot of different slashing damage types, and if you're using a Tower Shield in PvP for some reason, then you may as well go ahead and stick this on. So it's going to be an A tier for PvE and an S tier for PvP. Slowing Rupture applies a slow to every enemy that's hit by it for 5 seconds. Slow's not really that useful in PvE, but of course in PvP, very, very powerful. We're going to give it a D tier for PvE, but an S tier for PvP. Slowing Tether is a hilariously bad perk. It only reduces the target's movement speed for 3 seconds, and it's on a single target, and it also disappears when you switch away as well. I don't know why this is so bad compared to some of the other perks. We're going to give this a D tier in both PvE and PvP. Don't use this perk. Stable Incinerate is not a bad perk to run if you are going to use Incinerate. You probably want to take this. As a result, we're going to give it an A tier in both PvP and PvE. Stamina Recovery is a really, really good perk. I rate this super highly. We're going to give this an A+ in PvE and an S tier in PvP, as again, stamina I just think is a little bit more important in PvP. Steadfast Purification probably is the worst Greatsword perk I've seen so far. It just reduces the cooldowns by a small amount. I guess it could be good if you have it on the Greatsword, but I'm not rating it very highly. We're going to give it a D tier in both PvE and PvP. Strike Damage is pretty niche. Right now, there's only really the Warhammer and the Shield that like consistently do strike damage. So as a result, we're going to drop it down a few marks there. Going to be good against the Ancients. But in PvP, I guess if you're using a Warhammer, we're going to give it an A tier in PvE and a B tier for PvP. Strike Protection's pretty niche as there's not that many enemies out there doing strike damage. Maybe if Warhammer becomes meta, it would have more use in PvP, but right now we're giving it a D tier for both PvE and PvP. Strike Shield Ward, much like Strike Protection, again, there's just not much strike damage out there. It's a D tier for PvE and a D tier for PvP. Sturdy is a must-have perk if you're running a tower shield. If you're doing any form of blocking, tanking in both PvE and PvP, you really want to have this perk on your tower shield, so it's an S tier in PvE and an S tier for PvP. Sturdy energy, much like Sturdy, in my opinion, is a must-have for tanks, whether you're doing it in PvE or PvP. This is an S tier in both categories. Sturdy Fortification is a PvP only perk, and even then it's very specific. You gotta block enemy attacks to get Fortify. Maybe if like tanking comes around a bit more in PvP, we'll see this in use, but right now it's an F for PvE and a D for PvP. Sunder and Javelin is not a bad perk to have if you're gonna be using Javelin. Not that many people do, but if you are gonna run the perk, you probably wanna pick this one up. We're gonna give it a C tier for both PvE and PvP. Sundering Riposte takes what is already a very strong ability and makes it even stronger. However, you don't see that much riposte usage in PvE. We're going to give it a B tier for PvE, but an S tier for PvP. Sundering Shockwave is a must-have perk if you're running the Warhammer. You're going to be using Shockwave if you're using Warhammer. It's just a given. It's like a really good ability. So we're going to give this an S tier for both PvE and PvP. Sure Footing is not a bad perk to have if you are running a shield. If there's no shield, you definitely don't want this perk. But for that reason, we're going to give it a C tier in PvE and a B tier in PvP, as movement speed is a little bit more important there. Thrust damage is a no-brainer to have if you're running any sort of thrust-based weapon, rapier, spear, bow, musket. You just do extra damage, so this is an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Thrust protection, again, a lot of enemies in the game in both PvE and PvP do thrust damage, so we're giving this an S tier across the board. Thrust shield ward reduces the amount of damage you take from thrust damage, just like protection, but it's only for the tower shield. However, I do think having the mutation-specific damage reduction, so nature, ice, fire, is going to be more important, but this is really good in outpost rush and stuff because there's so many bows. So we're going to give it a B tier in PvE and an S tier for PvP. Thwarting Counter is basically a PvP only perk because there's really not that many instances where you fight enemies that have grit in PvE. They do exist, but it's much more relevant against, going against hatchets, great axe and stuff who have 300 strength. So we're going to give it a D tier for PvE and somewhere between a B to A tier for PvP. It really depends like what you're fighting against. Thwarting Strikes give you extra damage if you have active grit. You can get active grit by running 300 strength, so if you are a 300 strength weapon user, this is an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Trenchant Crits allows your fully charged heavy attacks to do additional crit damage. I think this is going to be very good for the Greatsword in particular because you can charge up heavies in that pretty easily. We're going to give this a C tier in PvE and a B tier for PvP. Again, more related to the Greatsword though. Trenchant Recovery gives you healing when you land the heavy attacks, but I think this is pretty meh. We're going to give this a D tier in PvE and a D tier for PvP. Trenchant Rend, another one with the heavy attacks, applies a rend when you land a heavy attack. Don't think it's that great. It's just like fairly okay. So we're going to give it a C tier in PvE and a C tier for PvP. Trenchant Strikes makes your heavy attacks just do extra damage. They don't have to crit. They just do extra damage. Again, going to be another good one to look out for with the Greatsword potentially. So we're going to give it a B tier in PvE and a B tier for PvP. Unbroken Winds is a bit of a meme sort of perk. It makes it so that Wind Chill does extra damage and it gives you grit. I don't think this is one you want to run in PvE as you're just going to push the mobs away from the tank and stuff and annoy them. But in PvP, it could be kind of fun. We're going to give it a D tier for PvE, C tier for PvP. Unending Thaw is the quintessential must-have perk for anybody using Ice Gauntlet. It makes your Ice Storm do extra damage, just a no-brainer. We're going to give it an S tier in both PvE and PvP. Venturing Clawshot has pretty specific requirements to activate, but it could be potentially good to set up some kills in PvP. We're going to give it a C tier in PvE and a B tier for PvP. Vicious increases your critical damage. This is going to be useful for any DPS build, and as a result, it's an S tier for PvE and an S tier for PvP. Vigor can be useful in many different situations. I don't think it's a must-have perk, but it's like not a bad one to have either. We're going to give it a B tier for PvE and a B tier for PvP. Void damage is obviously going to be great if you're running the Void Gauntlet. In that specific scenario, it's an S tier for PvE and an S tier for PvP. Void Protection is a great perk to have on your amulet for Void-specific mutation weeks, and also there's quite a few Void Gauntlets around in PvP as well, so we're going to give it an S tier for PvE and an A tier for PvP. Void Shield Ward, much like Void Protection, falls into the same categories. If you're in a Void mutated dungeon, you want to go ahead and take it. And if you find yourself going against a lot of Void Gauntlets, great to have on Tower Shield as well. We're going to give it an S tier for PvE and an A tier for PvP. Voracious Blade is a powerhouse of a perk for the Void Gauntlet. I think it's a little bit weaker than Putrefying Scream, but still really, really good. Just the lifesteal is bonkers on this one, so we're going to give it an S tier for PvE and an S tier for PvP. And finally, the last perk here is Vorpal. Increases your headshot damage. This is pretty niche, only going to work on ranged weapons and at that ranged weapons that can do headshots. I think you're just better off taking like Vicious or Keenly Empowered, so we're going to give it a C tier in both PvE and PvP. Okay, so that was a look at all of the perks in New World that are relevant for combat. Again, maybe you guys have some disagreements, and maybe I'm wrong about some particular perks, but I haven't seen anybody else try and like cover this in a long time, so hopefully some of you guys find it useful. Again, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you go ahead and click the like button, subscribe for more New World content like this, and I'll see you guys all in the next video.